I hope you have a chance to look about the brain tumors on Johns Hopkins University Pathology Department website. I think it is very interesting, and we talk about that in our lab session. So this is the cross section of the spinal cord. And spinal cord here, this is anterior and this is posterior. In the spinal cord, if we do the cross section, we will see a darker H-shaped structure, which we call the gray matter, and the lighter color outside the H shape, which is called the white matter. Why is this area is darker than the outside? Because it contains a lot of motor neurons, a lot of cell bodies of the interneuron, and therefore this area is much darker than the outside. Because outside here, it contains mostly the myelin sheet covered axon, and of course non-myelinated axon as well. Therefore, this color is much lighter comparing to the H-shaped color gray matter. Of course, because it is a nervous tissue, so either in gray matter or the white matter, we will have neuroglia cells. And you can see the motor neuron, which is colored with red, leaving the anterior horn of the gray matter and leaving the spinal cord in the ventral root here. And you can see the blue color sensory afferent fiber going into the spinal cord from the posterior horn of the gray matter. Yeah, so this is the posterior horn of the gray matter where the sensory nerve fibers come in, and this is the anterior horn of the gray matter, which is the leaving point for the motor neuron. So the same things will be happening in the opposite side. Here in the very center, we have a little cavity, which is what we call central cavity of the spinal cord. So combination of both sensory nerve fibers and motor nerve fibers, it is called the spinal nerve. So if you look at the spinal nerve here, the sensory fiber in the spinal nerve, this axon come here and go to the cell body and continue and synapse with the interneuron inside the spinal cord. And therefore, this is the unipolar neuron. If we are more careful, this is what we need to be thinking about. Of course, sensory neuron can be somatic sensory or visceral sensory. Somatic sensory, which are regarded as touch, temperature, pain, pressure, sensation, which will be carried by this blue color here. They go to the dorsal root ganglia, come into the spinal cord. Visceral sensory, such as those sensations come from our intestine, our liver, our lungs, heart. They will be traveling along this green sensory afferent fibers, and it will go into the spinal cord. And the same thing, motor can be divided again into somatic motor and visceral motor. As you can see here, the somatic motor neurons are leaving red color here from the ventral root, and the visceral motor neuron will be leaving here from the ventral root. So if we look at that, somatic sensory nerve, the ends most posterior, and visceral sensory are slightly anterior in the posterior horn of the gray matter. The same thing, like somatic motor, is very much anterior in the anterior horn, and visceral motor is slightly posterior and lateral to the somatic motor neuron. So these are the sites for the motor neurons. So all these, the afferent sensory fibers, efferent motor fibers combination is called spinal nerve, as we can see here. Spinal nerve, we continue as a single nerve, or spinal nerve, we join with other spinal nerves to form nerve plexuses, and nerve plexuses, from the nerve plexuses, we come out single spinal nerve. It depends on where we are. But when we get to a single nerve, this is the cross section of the single nerve. So the whole single nerve, of course, it is most inside, they are made of the axon. These axon will be covered with the myelin sheath, and that myelin sheath is again covered with another structure which is called endoneurium. So I hope you remember these terminology: endomysium, perimysium, epimysium, when we were talking about the muscle. So the same thing, like the layer which covers the myelinated axon, it is called endoneurium. Multiple endoneurium covered fibers are enclosed within a perineurium. That is what we call nerve vesicle. So nerve vesicle is a structure which is surrounded by the perineurium. Inside it, there will be endoneurium covered myelinated axons. So multiple vesicles together with blood vessels inside, again cover with another layer which is called epineurium. So this information is important because when we talk about the nerve repair, of course, depending on the type of the damage, depending on the size of the nerve we have to repair, sometimes we just repair the most outermost layer, which is the epineurium, and therefore it will be called epineural nerve repair. Sometimes, if the condition is favorable, we can go to each and every vesicle and reattach them together. Plus, this is the perineurial repair. Plus, of course, we repair the outermost epineuria, and therefore this is the perineural repair, which will be much more precise, but it is a lot more time consuming and conditions need to be favored. So now let's go to the reflex arc. Reflex means it happens as reflex and there is no high order thinking. Let's say if we have an unpleasant stimulus, sharp pointy stimulus on our skin, the skin receptor will start discharging the electrical impulse, which will traverse along the sensory neuron and then go to the spinal cord. And from the spinal cord, it enters the posterior horn of the gray matter, and via the interneuron, it will go to the anterior horn where the motor neuron lies. These motor neurons will discharge electrical nerve impulse, go to the effector organ, contract, so that we pull our hand away from that unpleasant stimulus. So now you can see the receptor sensory neuron, integrating center, which is the spinal cord, motor neuron, and effector organ. That completes a reflex arc. So now if we look at these diagrams, if we suddenly stretch the patellar ligament with the tapping, I hope you have to do that in the physiology class, sudden stretch, sudden tap of the patellar ligament by this tendon hammer, and that way stimulate the sensory receptor in the muscle, and that stimulus will travel along the sensory neuron, go to the integrating center, which is spinal cord, and you can see there is no interneuron here. It will directly act on the motor neuron, and motor neuron will come out from the ventral root, go to the muscle, get the muscle contraction, and therefore we see the knee jerk. Because there is no interneuron, and therefore we call monosynaptic reflex. Here, if you look at the diagram here, if we have another stimulus, which is sharp pointed or might be a heat, like a little light, if we go and touch it without thinking, we withdraw our hand. What was happening here, this unpleasant sensation, we stimulate the receptor in the skin at the tip of our finger. This stimulus will act as a sensory impulse. We travel along the sensory or afferent neuron, and we go to the spinal cord, which is the integrating center. Now we have an interneuron that doesn't go directly to the motor neuron. It goes via the interneuron to the motor neuron here, and the motor neuron come out and come to the muscle and makes the muscle to contract, pull our hand away from that unpleasant stimulus. Here, because we now have the interneuron, and therefore we call it polysynaptic neuron. So withdrawal reflex is polysynaptic reflex, and stretch reflex is monosynaptic reflex. And now if you think about the type of the neuronal circuits, types, the way neurons integrate and synapse onto another neuron. Here you can see one neuron will be acting on two other neurons, and each neuron will be acting on another two other neurons, and it multiplies. Because it is from 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, and therefore it is a diverging circuit. And here in the second diagram, multiple neurons like neuron 1, 2, and 3 will come and act on another neuron, and we have one output. Because all the information comes finally to one single neuron, and therefore we will say it is converging circuit. And here the last circuit is called reverberating circuit. You can see one output here, stimulate another neuron, stimulate another neuron, stimulate another neuron, that will finally come back and stimulate to each other. That is what we call reverberating circuits. So now we know that we have a withdrawal reflex and pleasant heat. Our finger skin tip, at the fingertip, we get this unpleasant sensation. That information will go along the sensory neuron. We need an interneuron to happen for the withdrawal reflex, come and act on the motor neuron, and motor neuron will go and contract the muscle, pull the hand away from the fire. This happened, but at the same time, the other neurons in the spinal cord get stimulated, and that information is going to travel along the spinal cord, go up to the brain, and there is an area in the brain which we call thalamus. In the thalamus, that we receive all these sensations, and finally that we go to the brain. And now we have the higher order thinking already. We know that the light, the fire is hot, and we will not do this again, or we might put our finger underneath the cool water to keep our finger cool, because this involves the higher order thinking now. That is what we call cortical pathway. Of course, spinal pathway, which is just with the sensory neuron, interneuron, and motor neuron, it is just happen at a reflex. It is rapid. All right, I'm going to stop our fundamental of nervous system lecture here. I hope you will go and study the lecture slides and video again. Thank you.